dense fog rolls over the San Francisco Bay like a suffocating blanket that obscures the world and traps the soul. In the middle of these icy waters sits a jagged rock that has become synonymous with despair and suffering. This is Alcatraz Island. It is a place where hope goes to die, and where the silence is loud enough to shatter the human mind. For decades, this isolated fortress served as the ultimate warehouse for the most dangerous men in the United States. They were sent here not to be rehabilitated, but to be broken by the relentless monotony and the crushing weight of stone and steel. But for some, the punishment did not end with their physical death, because the rock holds onto its prisoners forever. Alcatraz was designed to be escape-proof, but the concept of escape takes on a different meaning when you consider the supernatural. The cold currents of the Pacific Ocean churn violently around the island, serving as a natural moat filled with sharks and deadly tides. Even looking at the glimmering lights of the city across the bay was a form of psychological torture for the inmates. They could see life continuing without them, a reminder of everything they had lost and would never regain. The wind howls through the deteriorating cell blocks, carrying whispers that do not belong to the living. These are the voices of men who lived in hell and died in agony, leaving behind an energy that refuses to dissipate. Before it was a federal penitentiary, the island served as a military fortress and a prison for Civil War deserters and indigenous people who defied the government. The history of pain layered upon this limestone rock goes back well over a century, creating a deep reservoir of negative energy. Native Americans avoided the island long before the white man arrived, believing it to be inhabited by evil spirits. They called it a place of bad medicine, where strange sounds echoed in the mist and glowing eyes watched from the shadows. When the United States Army built a citadel atop this cursed ground, they merely constructed a cage for the darkness that was already there. In 1934, the island was transferred to the Department of Justice and reborn as the United States Penitentiary Alcatraz. It was the era of the Great Depression and the rise of the celebrity gangster. The public demanded a super prison for the likes of Alphonse Gabriel Capone and George Kelly Barnes. The facility was retrofitted with tool-proof steel bars and remotely operated doors that clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The warden, James Aloysius Johnston, was a strict disciplinarian who believed in work and silence. He implemented a rule of absolute silence that drove many inmates to the brink of insanity, as they were forbidden to speak a single word to one another for years. Imagine standing in a cell that is 5 feet by 9 feet. You can touch both walls if you stretch out your arms. The toilet is open for the guards to see, and the bed is a hard steel cot bolted to the wall. This tiny box is your entire universe for 16 hours a day. only reprieve is a brief walk in the walled recreation yard, where the high concrete barriers cut off the view of the ocean. The sensory deprivation was calculated to strip a man of his identity. In this vacuum of stimulation, the mind begins to hallucinate, and the boundary between reality and the supernatural begins to blur. Shadows in the corner of the cell start to move, and the dripping of a faucet sounds like a voice. One of the most notorious sections of the prison is D Block. This was the treatment unit where inmates were sent for punishment. It houses the solitary confinement cells, known simply as the Hole. These cells were devoid of light and freezing cold. Inmates were stripped to their underwear and thrown into pitch black darkness for days or weeks at a time. There was no bed, only the cold concrete floor. In this total darkness, time loses all meaning. Men would toss a button in the air and crawl around searching for it, just to have something to do. But in the dark, they often felt they were not alone. Something cold would brush against their skin, or heavy breathing would fill the stagnant air. It was in one of these cells, in D Block, specifically cell 14D, that a terrifying event took place in the 1940s. An inmate was dragged into the cell screaming that a creature with glowing red eyes was waiting for him in the dark. The guards laughed at him, thinking it was just another ploy to get out of solitary. They slammed the heavy steel door shut and locked it tight, leaving the man screaming in the pitch black void. For hours, he shrieked in terror, pounding on the door and begging for mercy. He claimed the thing was in the corner and it was coming for him. The other inmates in D Block could hear his cries echoing off the concrete walls. As the night wore on, the screams turned into low guttural moans. And then, finally, silence. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the screaming had been. The air in D Block grew impossibly cold, a chill that penetrated the bones of every prisoner in the vicinity. The guards ignored the silence, assuming the inmate had finally exhausted himself and fallen asleep. They went about their rounds, indifferent to the terror that had just unfolded. But the prisoners knew better. They could feel a heavy, oppressive presence moving through the corridor, a darkness that was thicker than the night itself. It was a presence that fed on fear. The next morning, when the guards opened the door to cell 14D, they found the inmate dead on the floor. His face was frozen in a contorted mask of sheer terror, his eyes wide open and staring at something only he could see. Mysterious purple bruises covered his neck, clearly indicating that he had been strangled. But he had been alone in the locked cell. The official report stated that he died of natural causes or self-inflicted wounds. But the guards who saw the body knew the truth. The finger marks on his throat were too large to be his own. Something else had been in that cell with him. The day after the tragedy in 14D, the guards were performing a standard head count. As they lined up the inmates, they counted one too many men. end of the line stood a figure that looked exactly like the deceased inmate from the night before. The guards rubbed their eyes in disbelief, thinking the fog or exhaustion was playing tricks on them. But for a fleeting moment, the figure stood there solid and real, staring back with dead, hollow eyes. Then, as quickly as he appeared, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving the guards trembling. This was the first of many sightings of the Phantom of D Block, another famous resident who left a spiritual mark on the prison was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. The once feared mob boss arrived at Alcatraz arrogant and demanding, but the Rock humbled him. He was denied all special privileges and forced to work in the laundry. However, it was not the guards that broke him, but the advanced syphilis that was eating away at his brain. Capone began to lose his mind. He became fearful and withdrawn, spending his recreation time playing the banjo. He would sit in the shower room alone, plucking out mournful tunes. Towards the end of his sentence, he was convinced he was being tormented by the ghost of James Clark, a victim of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Even today, park rangers and visitors report hearing the faint sound of a banjo echoing through the shower room. The melody is slow and disjointed, drifting from the empty stalls where Capone used to sit. The air in the shower room often drops in temperature suddenly, and people report feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness. Some have even claimed to see a heavy-set figure standing in the shadows, holding an instrument before fading away. It seems that the spirit of the gangster is still trying to find solace in his music, forever trapped within the concrete walls that stripped him of his power. The utility corridors behind the cells are another hotspot for paranormal activity. These narrow passageways allowed guards to access the plumbing and electrical systems, but they also served as echo chambers for the prison. In 1946, a violent escape attempt known as the Battle of Alcatraz took place. Inmates Bernard Coy and Joseph Kretzer managed to overpower guards and access the weapons locker. A bloody siege ensued, lasting 2 days. The United States Marines were called in to bombard the cell house with grenades. Coy and Kretzer were eventually killed in the utility corridor, their bodies riddled with bullets and shrapnel. The violence of the Battle of Alcatraz left a permanent scar on the atmosphere of the main cell house. Guards patrolling the utility corridor where the bodies were found often reported hearing the sounds of clanging metal and men running. The smell of smoke and cordite sometimes manifests out of nowhere, choking those who walk the narrow path. It is said that the spirits of Coy and Kretzer are still fighting their losing battle, eternally reliving the adrenaline and violence of their final hours. They are trapped in a loop of rebellion and death, unable to accept that the siege is over. One of the most terrifying entities on the island is known as the Butcher. His name was Abby Maldovitz, a hitman for the Jewish mob, who was feared for his brutality. He was killed by another inmate in the laundry room in the 1940s, but his spirit refused to leave. Maldovitz is said to haunt the laundry area, appearing as a dark, aggressive shadow. Visitors have reported feeling a strong pressure on their chest or being pushed by unseen hands. Photos taken in the laundry room sometimes reveal translucent anomalies or orbs hovering near the heavy industrial machinery where he met his violent end. The hospital ward on the upper floor of the prison is perhaps the most active area for supernatural occurrences. It was here that Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, spent years in a hospital cell. Stroud was a brilliant but psychopathically dangerous man who was kept isolated from the general population. The hospital was a place of sickness and death, where inmates went to die of tuberculosis or recover from stabbings. The energy here is heavy, and medical equipment is known to move on its own. Gurneys squeak as they roll down empty hallways, and the sound of coughing echoes from vacant rooms. Visitors to the hospital wing often describe a feeling of being watched. There is a specific room where the vibe is so intense that people physically recoil at the doorway. Psychics who have visited the island claim that the hospital is crowded with confused spirits who do not realize they are dead. They are still waiting for a doctor who will never come, or hoping for a cure that does not exist. The peeling paint and rusted surgical tables create a macabre backdrop for these lost souls. Shadows dart between the rooms, and the temperature fluctuates wildly from one step to the next. The morgue is located deep within the bowels of the prison, a cold, damp room with steel drawers for the bodies, though it was rarely used, as most bodies were transported to the mainland. Immediately, the fear associated with this room is palpable. It represents the final destination for those who died on the rock. There are stories of a heaviness in the air, here a pressure that makes it difficult to breathe. Some say that the spirits of those who died violently are drawn to this place, lingering near the cold steel slabs. It is a place of absolute finality, where the hopelessness of Alcatraz is concentrated into a physical force. In 1962, 3 inmates named Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers famously escaped from Alcatraz by digging through the ventilation shafts. They entered the water on a makeshift raft and were never seen again. While most believe they drowned in the freezing bay, some wonder if they truly escaped the island, or if the island claimed them in a different way. There have been reports of 3 shadowy figures standing near the water's edge on foggy nights, looking out toward San Francisco. Are these the ghosts of the escapees, forever contemplating the freedom they died trying to reach? When the prison was finally closed in 1963, due to high operating costs, the guards and remaining inmates were transferred off the island. The facility was left to rot in the salt air. For years, it sat abandoned the silence, reclaiming the cell blocks. But the stories of ghosts did not stop. If anything, they intensified. Without the noise of the living, the dead became louder. Watchmen hired to guard the empty island reported hearing the clang of cell doors slamming shut, and the murmur of hundreds of voices in the dining hall. During the 19 months of the Native American occupation in the late 60s and early 70s, the occupiers reported strange phenomena. They were there to reclaim the land, but they found themselves sharing it with the spirits of the prison era. Children of the occupiers would talk about playing with invisible friends in the cell blocks. Security patrols would see blue lights floating through the corridors. The occupiers respected the spirits, acknowledging that the suffering on the island had created a bridge to the spirit world that could not be closed. Today, Alcatraz is a national park and a major tourist attraction. Thousands of people visit the rock every day to take audio tour and step inside the cells. Yet despite the crowds, the ghosts make their presence known. Rangers have many stories they only share in hushed tones. One ranger described hearing the distinctive sound of a heavy metal door crashing shut while he was alone in a cell block. He checked every door and found them all locked and secure. The sound was unmistakable and terrifyingly loud, echoing through the empty tier. Another common occurrence involves the smell of smoke. The warden's house burned down during the occupation, leaving only a shell. But visitors frequently smell fresh smoke near the ruins. Inside the cell house, the smell of tobacco smoke often wafts through the air, even though smoking is strictly prohibited. It is the scent of the past, of thousands of men nervous and bored chain smoking to pass the time. These olfactory hallucinations are a sensory echo of the millions of hours of anxiety experienced within these walls. Night tour of Alcatraz are particularly popular and particularly unsettling. As the sun sets and the fog rolls and the atmosphere shifts dramatically, the natural light fades and the shadows stretch long and distorted across the floor. This is when the island feels most alive with the dead. Visitors often capture strange figures in their photographs, a face peering through the small window of a cell door, or a shadow standing on the gun gallery. These images are often dismissed as pareidolia, but the frequency with which they occur is disturbing. One tourist captured a photo of a young woman staring through the window of the visitation room. The figure looked solid and wore clothing from the 1940s. However, the room was empty at the time. The visitation room was a place of immense emotional turmoil, where inmates would try to connect with their loved ones through thick glass. The longing and heartbreak felt in that room have imprinted themselves on the space, creating a loop of sorrow that cameras seem to pick up more than the human eye. The lighthouse on the island is the oldest on the west coast, and has its own share of phantom sounds. On stormy nights, when the wind whips around the tower, a phantom whistling is often heard. It mimics the sound of the old foghorns used in the 19th century. But more chilling are the reports of screams carried on the wind near the cliffs. These are thought to be the echoes of inmates who may have jumped or fallen to their deaths in desperate suicide attempts, swallowed by the unforgiving sea. There is a section of the prison known as Broadway, the central corridor between the two main cell blocks. It is grand and imposing. At night, rangers claim to hear footsteps walking up and down Broadway. The footsteps are heavy and rhythmic, like the boots of a guard on patrol. They walk the length of the corridor, pause, and then turn around. It is a residual haunting, a recording of the endless patrols that took place here for 30 years. The guard who walks this beat is long dead, but his duty remains unfinished. Psychics who visit Alcatraz describe the island as a psychic sponge. The limestone rock absorbs the emotional energy of the people who lived there. Limestone is believed by paranormal investigators to be a conductor for spiritual activity. With so much misery condensed into such a small area, it is no wonder the island is a beacon for the supernatural. The energy is chaotic and dark, a mixture of fear, anger, and insanity. It is not a place where spirits rest in peace. It is a place where they are trapped in their torment. In the solitary confinement cells, sensitive visitors often feel a sudden onset of nausea or dizziness. It is a physical reaction to the intense negative energy. Some have had to leave the tour immediately unable to withstand the oppressive feeling. It is as if the air itself is heavy with the memory of suffering. This is not just a spooky feeling. It is a physiological response to an environment that was designed to destroy the human spirit. The walls remember the screams, and the floor remembers the bodies. The story of Alcatraz is a story of the dark side of humanity. It shows us what happens when we lock men away and throw away the key. But it also shows us that we cannot simply bury our mistakes. The ghosts of Alcatraz are a reminder that suffering leaves a mark. They are the shadows that refuse to be cast out by the light. They are the voices that refuse to be silenced. The prison may be closed, but the inmates are still there, serving a sentence that has no end. As you take the ferry back to San Francisco, leaving the rock behind you, feel a sense of relief. The city lights are welcoming and warm, but as you look back at the island shrouded in mist, you cannot help but feel that something is watching you leave. The empty windows of the cell house look like skull sockets staring blindly across the bay. You have escaped Alcatraz, but you know that for the souls trapped within those walls, there is no escape. They are the permanent residents of the rock, bound to the stone and the sea forever. The legend of Alcatraz continues to grow with each passing year. New stories emerge from visitors and staff, adding to the tapestry of terror. It remains one of the most haunted places in America, a monument to misery that stands defiant in the cold waters. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the atmosphere of Alcatraz is undeniable. It forces you to confront the reality of what happened there. It is a place where the line between history and horror is non-existent. So the next time you look out at the San Francisco Bay and see that grim silhouette against the gray sky, remember the men who lived and died there. Remember the screaming man in cell 14D. Remember the banjo of Al Capone. Remember the cold eyes of the butcher. They are not just stories, they are the echoes of a living hell. And if you listen closely enough over the sound of the wind and the waves, you might just hear them calling out to you, warning you to stay away. Alcatraz Island remains a solitary sentinel of suffering. It is a grim reminder that some places are stained so deeply with pain that they can never be clean. The cold, damp corridors still hold the breath of the condemned. The rusted bars still hold the grip of desperate hands. The living may visit and leave, but the dead remain. Alcatraz is truly an escape from the living, not from the ghosts. And as the fog rolls in once more, the island disappears from sight, taking its secrets and its spirits back into the gray void.